good. Everything looks great. Okay, so I see we already have Renzo in the live stream. Let me see if our live stream is on. Please let us know if you have audio, if anybody could hear us. Yep. Can you say something? Testing. Say something? Landon?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, I see people in the live chat. Hi, Renzo. I just had to finish the live chat with Renzo, by the way, and now he's in the live chat. Hello, guys. I'm new. What is the stream about? Okay, this stream is going to be about Enlightenment values versus Christianity. Let us know if you can hear us, both of us, and let us know how the audio is. And basically, what we're going to be discussing is whether we're going to be addressing the claim that Western values come from Christianity, or if Christianity deserves any credit for any of the Enlightenment values or anything that people call modern values, Western values, Enlightenment values. And we have a very good guest today to go over that. We have an expert. Can you introduce yourself?
Somewhat. My name is Landon Haynes. I'm an author with Atheist Republic. It's my second podcast about this subject.
This one's going to be a lot more specific, right? And you have some stuff that you want to go over with us. But what is
Yeah.
your book, by the way, and where can people get it?
Yeah. So a justified faith.
A little bit to my right, to your left. A Justified Faith, Landon Haynes. Okay, what is that book about?
It's about the progress of humanity, basically. That humanity is the justified faith, and in opposition to religion as a justified faith.
All right, I'm gonna link to it after in the description, so go check that out. So let
Oh,
us let, at some point we're gonna have a podcast specifically discussing your book because that's an important topic. But today we're going to be talking specifically about whether or not Christianity deserves any credit for Western values. How you respond to
yeah.
that? Like, do you want to go over what are we
Yeah.
going to cover today? Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things is we on our last podcast we touched on the Protestant Reformation, and I know you had heard a lot. A lot of people say that it had a lot to do with it, which it kind of did, but not in any thematic way, not as far as its values, right?
Not on purpose.
Right, because it could have been anything that broke the hegemony of the Catholic Church. It could have been something else,
Right.
right? So yeah,
Or and
so I
nothing
wrote a little.
and based nothing from within the Bible and nothing that any of the Reformation thinkers are actively promoted is responsible for that, basically.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was kind of almost in spite of themselves that they may have helped the Enlightenment, right?
Right.
So I wrote a little short paragraph not too long after our last podcast 6 months ago or whatever it was. Um, Paragraph goes, Western values come from Judeo-Christian principles. Christianity is about obedience and authority, even submission to worldly authority, which is assigned by God, not freedom. Its God is a tyrant. Scripture says nothing about democracy, and Christian history is one of massacring people for incorrect views, and in no way preaches freedom of religion. Christianity has, and the Bible does, subject women and condone slavery. It commands faith, not questioning, contrary to science and philosophy, and condemns affluence and striving for wealth while preaching to stay in your station in life, contrary to capitalism. The focus and the goal is the next life, not the betterment of this life in this world.
Okay, so let me just, for the people that are not familiar with this, let me give you the main points that people bring to say that without Christianity, we wouldn't be having Western values, we wouldn't be having human rights, we wouldn't be having freedom of speech. The main things that I keep hearing over and over again is that Christianity promoted individual liberty, and that's why it was responsible for Enlightenment values. They also say that Christianity, for the first time, put a huge focus on the value of human life, and that was revolutionary, and that's why Christianity is responsible for Enlightenment values and Western values. They also, a lot of people mention that the Reformation was what was a fight against authoritative religious practices, and the Reformation eventually led to Europe, having human rights and Western, what we call Western values. And the last argument, the one that I keep hearing, is that the fact that Western values or Enlightenment values or modern values, whatever you call them, they became so popular in the fact that they got adopted in mostly Christian countries, and the fact that you don't see them in they didn't start in other countries. They didn't start in Islamic countries. They say that that's
right
proof. Well, let me finish the last one. The fact that you see it in Christian countries shows that Christianity had something to do with it. So these are the four main things that people say.
Well, you noticed when we got the human rights movement and all that, right, and the Enlightenment, that happened at the exact time that Christianity started to be questioned and challenged as never before, right? That's when we started getting all that stuff, not before then, right?
Okay, so actually that reminds me, that brings me to another, just reminds me of another fifth argument that I hear from atheists, at least, is that even if Christianity had nothing to do with it, Christianity was passive enough for Enlightenment thinkers to be able to challenge it. So at least the least credit you could give to Christianity is the fact that it was weak enough to be able to allow itself to get challenged.
Do you know how it got weak?
Where?
Many religious wars and persecution and bloodshed and people getting tired of it. Right. So, because it got broken down and it got challenged and it lost its authority. If it had the same authority as it did before, you think it would be in a passive state where all that's, where it would allow for that to happen. Right. Like look at from the fall of the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, up until like the Renaissance and even through the Renaissance. You think it was passive then? The Crusades, the Inquisition, and Inquisitions all over the world. I mean, from there's various, like in Peru there was an Inquisition. In Mexico there was an Inquisition. All over the place. The Crusades lasted 200 years. The witch burnings, like 500. It wasn't passive at first for most of its history. Right. So that's
just to be clear to our audience. By the way, there's a huge echo right now, and that's because you don't have a headset. But in future discussions, we're gonna get you a headset. But so I'm playing devil's advocate here, right? So I agree. Just for the people that don't know, that I completely agree that Enlightenment values don't need to thank Christianity. In fact, they were against Christianity. But to the point that you just brought, like the Inquisition and all the Crusades and whatever, what people say that you can't. What people would respond to that, what Christians might respond to that, is that you can't really trace any of that to the Bible, like the Inquisition. All those killings, there's nothing in the Bible that advocates for any of that. If you look at like all the crimes in Islam, all the jihad, all the barbarity, you could directly link that to something in the Quran or in the Hadith. But when you want to blame Christianity for an Inquisition, show me where in the Bible it promotes any of that. So that's what that's what the response is going to be.
Okay, Deuteronomy 6, I think, or no, Deuteronomy 13. It says, "Go kill everybody that doesn't worship your God." Off the top of my head. Revelation, it says everybody's going to be burnt up. That's not a Christian. And it says, spare no wish to live. That's a direct, authorization for witch burning.
Right.
I mean, really, it's all through the Bible.
Right.
Let me give you a quote of Steven Pinker here. Institutionalized torture in Christendom was not just an unthinking habit; it had a moral rationale. If you really believe that failing to accept Jesus as one's savior is a ticket to fiery damnation, then torturing a person until he acknowledges this truth is doing him the biggest favor of his life. Better a few hours now than an eternity later. and silencing a person before he can corrupt others or making an example of him to deter the rest is a responsible public health measure. So, I mean, it just follows naturally. You know, if you think people are going to hell, they don't believe what you believe, you know, that's what you get, right?
It would be the most moral thing to do.
Yeah.
Um, so you wanted to go over some of the values. So the trick that people play to give the credit to Christianity for Western values is to tie in the Enlightenment era progress that we made in Europe, to tie that somehow to Reformation, right?
Right.
And they were, because the leaders of that movement were using Christianity or Christian arguments. They say, well, there you go. See, without the Reformation, you wouldn't have Enlightenment. And so given that Reformation was a movement, a Christian movement, Christianity deserves credit for Enlightenment. So, by the way, what year? So the Reformation was what time, and the Enlightenment era is what time? Like, if you want to give people some perspective.
Sure. Martin Luther came along in I think 1513 or 1517, beginning of the 1500s.
Right.
You know, he posted his little letter, you know, on the door of the Catholic Church, and he was preaching against the sale of indulgences and things like that. So at the beginning of the 1500s for the Reformation, the Enlightenment is generally 1650 or 1680 to 1800, more or less.
Right.
So
to give some credit to what the people are saying, it's true that the Reformation movement really did challenge the authority of the Catholic Church, and they also popularized protesting and challenging authority, which is something that helped the Enlightenment movement. But the counterpoint to that is that was the Enlightenment movement was not the goal of the Protestant Reformation. In fact, it was completely, the values that they were advocating was completely against the Enlightenment movement, and so it wasn't by design; it was by accident. So anything that basically, but we can admit that the fact they did popularize protesting, but this act of questioning authority and fighting against authority figures, even though that was part of the Reformation, it doesn't have any Christian backing for that, right? In fact, accepting authority is more like a Christian value than challenging authority, isn't it?
Yeah, where in the Bible does it preach freedom of religion or freedom at all?
Right, exactly. So two counterpoints to that is that the Protestant thinkers were not thinking of eventually getting to Enlightenment values. That's just something, a byproduct, a happy byproduct. That, and also even though they did popularize challenging authority, that is no Christian value. And you actually have some examples of the values of the Reformation thinkers that goes exactly in opposition of Enlightenment values. Correct?
Oh yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
You want me to get on those?
Yeah.
It's pretty lengthy reading. Some of it, I can go through it though.
Can you just like summarize some of the main?
I'll do my best.
Yeah.
I'll do my best.
Okay.
All right. So in his 65,000 word treatise on the Jews and their lies, Martin Luther offered the following advice on what Christians should do to the rejected and condemned people. First, set fire to their synagogues and schools, bury and cover with dirt what will not burn, so that no one will ever again see a stone or cinder of them. I advise that their houses be razed and destroyed. Their prayer books and Talmudic writings should be destroyed. I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach on pain or loss of life and limb. I advise, that's not relevant.
Very, very anti-Jewish.
Yeah, right. And then with the Anabaptists, who are the forerunners of today's Amish and Mennonites, he said that they should be put to death. The other founder of Protestantism, which was John Calvin, he had a similar view about blasphemy and heresy. Get to what he had to say there. He said, God makes it plain that the false prophet is to be stoned without mercy. We are to crush beneath our heels all natural affectations when his honor is at stake. The father should not spare his child, nor the husband his wife, nor the friend that friend who is dearer to him than life. Calvin put his argument into practice by ordering, among other things, that the writer Michael Servetus, who had questioned the Trinity, be burned at the stake in Geneva. Another main rebel against Catholicism was Henry VIII, and his administration burned on average 3.25 heretics per year. This stuff does not ring of modern values of freedom of religion, press, speech, conscience, at all. So I don't understand how anybody can argue that.
So when we think of Enlightenment values, oh my God, the echo. When we think about Enlightenment values, we think mostly about freedom of expression, due process. What else? What else comes to mind when we think about Enlightenment values? Freedom of belief, freedom of practicing your religion. What else do we think of?
Let me get to those notes here.
The point I'm trying to make is that can you think of any Bible verses, anything from the Bible or from Christian doctrine that could be in any way tied to any of these values at all?
Well, if you take the very best sayings of Jesus, and you put them in a bubble and don't connect them to anything else about Christianity, right? Including hell and everything else, then maybe you could get, you'd be nice, right?
Give me an example of something that people.
Well, like the Sermon on the Mount, you could say, treat your neighbor good, right? I mean, but that's not really. That's like That's not even a philosophy. Well, it's very, people said that way before him, right? And many other people have said that. That's not really a systematic worldview that, about freedom and all of that. So
the two examples people give is one is the golden rule and the other one is the treat your neighbor with love your neighbor and stuff, right? Which is such, which first of all, they're not at all new. When people want to defend Christianity, they make it seem like that these moral values are something revolutionary for its time. But if you look at them, first of all, they're very simplistic, they're very naive, they're very childish. And if you look at historically, the way Greek philosophers talk about ethics and morality was a lot more nuanced and with a lot more thought and a lot more advanced. It's not like nobody thought about the fact that being kind to people is a good thing before, right?
Right.
And in fact, and people think, and in fact, there are other, standards that were enforced by Hammurabi or by the Persian Empire, which they had their first recorded in history Declaration of Human Rights was years before the Bible was ever written. So there was nothing new about them. In fact, what was new about the Bible, at least what was new about the Bible as recorded in history, is the idea of eternal torture. That was revolutionary. That was the
revolution. Right about that,
yeah, that was the
eternal torture.
Yeah. The revolutionary part of the Bible was the idea of eternal torment for people that don't believe in a certain thing. So if you want to talk about revolutionary, the most inhuman, the most sadistic suggestion in history was started by the Bible. That's the contribution of the Christian ideology, of the Christian doctrine when it comes to values. But go on.
But you were talking about the values of the Enlightenment or modernity, right?
Right.
So democracy, racial and sexual equality, individual liberty of lifestyle, full freedom of thought, expression, press, eradication of religious authority from the legislative process and education, separation of church and state, the absolutes, according to Peter Gay, one of the big names of Enlightenment scholars, the absolutes of the Enlightenment were freedom, tolerance, reason, and humanity. and to substitute reliable information and rational theory for guessing and metaphysics, and to use newly won knowledge in behalf of man. Let's see. And so also Protestantism was the reverse of secularism or skepticism, and it was in spite of themselves that the Protestants, brought that about. And one thing that's really surprising to me is I hadn't studied the early Enlightenment that much, like the 1600s, late 1600s. Well, like this book that I'm on now, if you can see it clearly, it's Radical Enlightenment.
A little bit more to your left. Okay, Radical Enlightenment, okay.
By Jonathan Israel. It's a trilogy about the Enlightenment. It's like 1,000 pages. In the 1600s, they were constantly talking about atheists all the time, like atheist works, atheist philosophies, atheist schools. And I was pretty surprised by that.
A lot of people Enlightenment thinkers were talking about that?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I mean, this book is constantly, the word atheist is in there, citing people that were talking about it, right? And I was surprised by that. I didn't realize that, I was thinking more of, around the middle of the 1700s and on, you have a lot more atheists, we talked about the Holbach, the system of nature, the atheist Bible, Diderot and Condorcet, and a lot of people in the French Revolution. But even back then, they were, I was surprised by that. So I'd recommend people that really want to dig into that stuff, check that book out and all of his work, actually. So it's really interesting.
So what about, so you mentioned secularism. Doesn't the Bible says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's? What's that verse? Doesn't that suggest secularism?
Some people have some great commentary on this, and I wish I would have took more notes on. That's more about taxes, right?
Yes.
Talking about
that. Yeah. Actually, that's exactly right. That's specifically about taxes. In fact, there's another part of the Bible where it actually tells you that you have to follow the authority, follow the.
That's another thing.
No, sorry. There's another part of the Bible that actually says that you should follow God's law. You should prefer God's law over man's law. I wish I had Jim here because he knows exactly which verse I'm talking about. Which letters was that? That's in the New Testament, I think. But the Bible actually, when the verse that is talking about give to Caesar what is Caesar's, is specifically talking about just taxes. It's not talking about following certain rules of law or certain orders. In fact, when it does talk about following orders, it specifically says that you shouldn't be following man's law and following God's law, which not at all is a suggestion of separation of church and state.
Right.
It completely contradicts that. I'm going to ask Jim which verse that is, and I'm going to, when he tells me, I'm going to leave that in the description. But go on, so you want to say something? Another
point is people that thought that the world was ordained by God and that he had put all the institutions in place, right? And the morals and the social relations of people, including, women and, we had the divine right of kings. God placed the king and the kings above the people and all that. People that believed in that, they had a hard time trying to say that, we should eradicate all that, or it's all inherently corrupt, right? And should be wiped away or drastically altered, right? Because it's ordained by God, right? It's how can we, and they also, people that thought like that, they had a big problem squaring that with all the human misery, right? That's why the 1755 earthquake in Lisbon, wiped out thousands of people. And it was on a Sunday, I think. The people were in their churches and they got wiped out while they were praying, and brothels were left intact. And people like Voltaire and others there, they had trouble, it kind of shook Europe because, these things are very difficult to square.
What do you say to the people that say, look, it was a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers were Christian?
They weren't, though. That's not true.
Okay.
It's not true. Name me a Christian Enlightenment. There were some. I'm not saying that they didn't exist, but okay, name me a Christian Enlightenment thinker. Go for
it. Well, you tell me what was their religion then?
Okay, Voltaire was a deist.
Okay.
Rousseau was a deist. Two biggest names. Diderot started a deist and became an atheist, one of the biggest atheists. That's the third biggest name. Anthony Collins, he wrote a book called A Discourse on Free Thinking in 1713. He was a deist. Toland was a deist. Spinoza was kind of an atheist, pantheist.
Pantheist is atheist.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
They called him atheist all the time.
Right.
Who else? Thomas Hobbes, he was pretty much an atheist. David Hume was an atheist and skeptic. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, deists.
But even if they were Christian, it doesn't mean that they got these values out of Christianity. The same.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, like, even if they, like, the way, for example, if somebody is a Muslim scientist, that doesn't mean Islam promotes science. If somebody is a Christian fan, is a Christian at the same time a big fan of Game of Thrones, that doesn't mean that being a fan of Game of Thrones makes it is part of Christianity, right? Muslims are more than just Muslims. They get their values not just from Islam, they get their values from other places. Christians get their values from other places other than just Christianity, right? And just because So another argument people make is like it was the Christians that fought against slavery and freed a lot of slaves. And that shows that Christianity is to be thanked for that, right? How would you, basically the same response. First of all, I don't know.
They traded in slaves for 1,000 years before that. So.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible...
And again, when did that change? During the Enlightenment period, when Christianity was getting challenged left and right.
Actually, that's a very good point, because if Christianity is responsible for Enlightenment values, then why did it take until these anti-Christian Enlightenment thinkers to show up and do what they did for these values to become popular? Because they had 1,600 years of Christianity, and none of these values were condoned by any by Christianity, by any Christian nation. So why did it take until Enlightenment era where these values become popular? It had nothing to do with Christianity. Like, if people want to say that the fact that these values became popular in mostly Christian countries shows that they come from Christianity, well, then the same reasoning can be used to say, well, it doesn't, because for 1,600 years these Christian countries were adopting values that goes exactly against all these modern Enlightenment values. But go on.
I have another book to flash for you, if you can see it clearly.
Okay.
I don't know.
Read it for our podcasters.
The Enlightenment, the Rise of Modern Paganism. Gay was one of the biggest
a little bit to your left.
Enlightenment scholars. Is it?
Yeah, I see. Okay.
So one of his main thesis of the book is that the Enlightenment was the rise of modern paganism. So it was actually taking pagan values, and if you think about it, in the Renaissance, they rediscovered Lucretius, who espoused atomism and the atomism of Democritus and Epicurus, right? And that was a big thing that happened that kind of also helped break the at least in intellectual circles, the mental shackles of Christianity and all of that. So you want to say the Enlightenment came about by Christianity? Here's one of the leading scholars talking about actually it's kind of a rise of modern paganism, because if you think about the ancient Greeks and some of the Romans, they were free thinkers. They were, they didn't have any shackles on their thought, right? They, of course, that's where we first get democracy and all kinds of things. But yeah, so there's another big point for you right there.
Right.
Some people think of it as modern paganism. So
you mentioned Sermon on the Mount. Can you mention what are some of the things in the Bible from whatever Jesus said that in the Bible or alleged to have said that people link to? Like, do you know any specific verses or any other than love your neighbor? Is that the only thing? Like, I can't think of anything else. There's nothing.
I can't
there.
either. Not really.
I mean, the book. it's very interesting to me where people, especially a lot of atheists, even say like, yeah, the Old Testament is batshit crazy, but the New Testament is pretty loving and encourages love. Where it really doesn't. Like, it's a book that suggests that anybody that doesn't believe in Jesus is going to be burning forever. Like,
It's a book full of contradictions too. So you
Yeah.
find one thing, you'll find something to contradict it.
I mean, Jesus specifically said, "I'm not here to bring you peace. I come here to bring you sword, right? The sword." And
Right.
he said, and he also said that you should hate your own family, and you should love me instead. So I mean, I don't. It's why do you think this argument is so common though? Like, I see this. Given that it seems to me pretty obvious, like every time people are like, "Oh, come on, of course Christianity has something to do with the Western values," and it takes like 5 minutes worth of questioning for you to realize that they can't pinpoint exactly what they mean. Like, you're like, okay, show me where these Enlightenment values, how these Enlightenment values come from Christianity, and they can't. And given how, like, these are great thinkers that I'm talking, like, these are very popular thinkers and writers that are saying this, and I'm not seeing a single example, a single argument that makes any, like, that passes 2 minutes or like a few minutes worth of thinking. Like, you just ask them where is it coming from, and they have nothing to show. Show me how this is coming from Christianity. Why is it so? Why, if they can't, why is this so popular?
So I think the Christian writers, right, the apologists, they have a vested interest in twisting things and doing mental gymnastics to try to make it that. As far as the common people and the general culture, I think it's a combination of being ignorant of history and scripture, and history in general, and because also everything they see, like when people do good things, who gives out free food and helps, sends out missionaries to help people? It's the church, right? Because that's how society formed through the accidents of history. This is the religion that we got in our culture, and they're the people that often do things because they channel their good human instincts through the only institution they've ever known. So people see that, and it just connotes that immediately, and that's just kind of how things have developed. So I think they're combinations of things that can explain that pretty easily.
I don't even see it as mental gymnastics. It's actually worse than that. They're not even making the argument. It's just a claim. Like, I wish they would go as far as actually making the mental gymnastics, because it's just like when you ask them why do they think it comes from Christian values, it just stops. It's just like, well, of course it does. Where do you think it came from? I'm like, well, show me. Like, I haven't even seen the mental gymnastic. It's just a claim and nothing else. Like, I wish there was some mental gymnastics that we could actually now look at and, but it's not there. It's just like, well, this came out of here. Well, how? This is actually exactly the opposite of what the Enlightenment values stand for.
Well, hey, I mean, religion is full of empty assertions and circular logic. So
but this comes from what is weird about this claim that Christianity is responsible for Enlightenment values is that it comes from atheists as well. I think they.
Is there a name? Do you know of a name? Any specific scholar that's made that claim?
Well, I mean, I wasn't. So, for example, well, not scholar. I mean, it's interesting because one of the greatest advocates for Enlightenment values, Steven Pinker, he was trying to go over it to suggest it a little bit that maybe Christianity has something to do with it on the Secular Judges podcast, and he mentioned to us that, well, maybe the idea that human life is valued comes from Christianity. And I have
a quote from Pinker that you reminded me. Let me get back to that when you get done.
But then I asked him, how could you say that? How could we say? Well, he didn't say it. He was just thinking it out loud on the podcast, right? And they're like, well, this is a religion that introduced us the idea of eternal torture. Are we really going to give credit to a religion that introduced us to the idea of eternal torture? Are we going to credit it for a religion that introduced us to valuing human life?
You heard my quote from Pinker a few minutes ago about how.
And he agreed. By the way, just to be fair to Pinker, he said yes, that's you're right. We can't give credit to Christianity for that. But go on for the quote.
Okay. Let's see.
Let me get the book. By the way, the book Enlightenment Now
Okay.
by...
Well,
Yeah, go on.
I would say his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is the best book I've ever read. Yeah, that's an awesome book. I actually met Steven Pinker in Atlanta at the Atlanta History Center, and I got my book signed by him, and I gave him a copy of my book too, so that was cool.
Yeah,
Um,
go on.
but okay, so I'll get to that quote in just a second. When we talk about the causes of the Enlightenment, right?
Right.
One of them, was just the wars, right? It was just attrition from all of the bloodshed, and like the Christianity had an attitude of like, this world is fallen, it's going to burn, it's all about the next life, right? And people didn't have the confidence to think that they could or they should try to improve this world, and that they could do it, and that they could, find the means to do it. And so that's another big difference between the Enlightenment and the modern world and Christianity. How Christianity was for 1,000 years, it was all like, the world is lost and fallen, and original sin, and all of that was just, it was just blanketed all over everywhere. That was the kind of the mindset. And so people started to gain confidence. They started to see that ancient beliefs could be wrong and harmful, and that people could think for themselves. And the biggest key, I think, in history is replacing revelation with investigation. You know, so
Yeah, I mean, one of the greatest things about Enlightenment way of thinking is the fact that um, things needs to be tested and be proven to work, right? Like, and
right,
constantly being skeptical about, and that goes against Christianity all the time, right? Which constantly promotes just believing, without questioning things and just accepting things. And another great idea that mostly came from Enlightenment era is that the constant improvement of the values. Like, then nothing about these values are sacred. The only reason why we like the Enlightenment values is because, not because they're divine or anything, or they're coming from a position of authority, but because because we can demonstrate and we can prove that they actually help humanity, and wherever they've been implemented, they have people have benefited immensely from it. And that's why that whole mindset is important. And even if the great thing about this is that even if the values are shit, you could constantly improve it. Even if there's a problem, like the Enlightenment values didn't say like, okay, here's some values and now just go with it, and don't change it anymore. They're not set in stone. The constant rethinking it and trying to come up with better values and improving it. That was a major thing that came with the package of what they offered to us, right? And
right,
I think what the problem with the Enlightenment values and Enlightenment era philosophers is a PR problem, because I think book like these are needed to show how much, book like Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker are needed to show how much we have benefited from this. Like, I think people are so ungrateful to these thinkers, and they have no idea how much they benefited from, and the only reason why they got spread so much is because they work. And nobody, like, that there's not that many people that felt like they need to come and promote this, because they just work. So why would I need to promote this? They work, so that's why everybody is using them, right? But the fact
right,
that we didn't do the promotion, we didn't went and actively as actively as these Christians and Muslims are doing, and go and show how much people are indebted to these values, because we didn't take an active role in doing that, in communicating with that people. And people think, why would you do that? You just use ideas that work. Well, now we see why people do that, because what Islam and Christianity will do is that they will come and take credit for ideas way better than themselves. And when you don't actively go and communicate where people are getting all the benefits from, they will come and fill in the gap of the promotion that you're not doing. They will come and say, like, not only you need to thank us for these values that we had nothing to do with, this is actually true Islam, and this is true Christianity, and the only, like, this is This has been completely in line with everything we. As soon as they become very popular, they just jump on the bandwagon, and all of a sudden, these values become exactly what Muhammad had in mind, or exactly what Jesus had in mind, and we have to kick them off of the bandwagon and tell them, no, get the fuck out. You were always in our way. You've been fighting against these values for generation, and you don't get to get on this bandwagon. In fact, we have to kick you off, because if you become popular again, if you go in power again, if you get authority again, we are pretty sure that you're going to be fighting against these values again. You shouldn't be thanked for any of these things. In fact, you should be condemned for making it so hard for us to gain these values for this late, because without you, we would have been here ages ago.
Christianity is like a caged lunatic. You don't want to set it free, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
So,
and this is what a lot of Christian apologist atheists are doing. They're like looking at the Christianity and it's a caged lunatic, and they're like, hey, it doesn't look harmful. Let's open the cage. I'm like, well, you
or
fucking
let's pick up a
idiot.
history book.
I'm like, the reason why it's not harmful is because it's in a fucking cage. Okay? In fact,
Yeah, let's pick up a history book and show them what it looked like
yeah,
when they have power, right?
yeah, exactly. But
We talk about the causes of the Enlightenment, right?
okay.
Exploration was a cause. People's minds got opened by seeing people in China that were doing just fine without Christianity, and the world was a lot bigger than people thought. And it's like, oh, we had this revelation here, but God, these people are over here and they didn't know anything about it and they're doing fine and things like that. And they have a deep history, older than ours. Another one, again, was a war and persecution, right? So the wars of religion, right? Here's a list of some of the wars of religion that got us, people getting tired of the bloodshed. The wars of religion embraced the French Huguenot Wars, 1562 to 94, the Dutch Wars of Independence, also known as the 80 Years' War, 1568 to 1648, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, the English Civil War, 1642 to 48, the Wars of Elizabeth I in Ireland, Scotland, and Spain, 1586 to 1603, the War of the Holy League, 1508 to 16, Charles V's wars in Mexico, Peru, France, and the Ottoman Empire, 1521 to 52, and also the rates of death in these wars were staggering. During the 30 Years' War, soldiers laid waste to much of present-day Germany, reducing its population by around a third.
Oh my God.
And the rates of death in some of these are greater than like World War I. And so it was basically in the second half of the 17th century that Europeans finally began to lose their zeal for killing people with the wrong supernatural beliefs. Like we had the Peace of Westphalia and some others. Okay, so you can ask, what made Europeans finally decide that it was all right to let their dissenting compatriots risk eternal damnation by their bad example and lure others to their fate. One of the things, and Steven Pinker makes this argument, is people started to place a higher value on human life. Part of this newfound appreciation was an emotional change, a habit of identifying with the pains and pleasures of others. Another part of it was an intellectual and moral change, a shift from valuing souls to valuing lives. So the gradual replacement of lives for souls as the locus of moral values was helped along by the ascendancy of skepticism and reason. So no one can deny the difference between life and death or the existence of suffering, but it takes indoctrination to hold beliefs about what becomes of an immortal soul after it has parted company from the body. The 17th century is called the Age of Reason, an age when writers began to insist that beliefs be justified by experience and logic. That undermines dogmas about souls and salvation, and it undermines the policy of forcing people to believe unbelievable things at the point of a sword or a Judas cradle. So that's another thing, valuing souls over valuing lives. It can be a pretty dangerous thing. obviously.
Yeah. Because even any amount of, again, there's so much echo. Sorry about that, guys. Even if there is even if you could point to any care in Christianity for, uh, it's not necessarily for people in this life. It's about their eternal souls,
Right.
which is basically could come as a sacrificing their well-being in this world for their eternal souls in the next world, which is a very dangerous way of thinking about our well-being. Basically, any that line of thinking leads to sacrificing the only life that we ever get for something for nothing. By the way, Jim just responded to me on Facebook. Um, the In response to a lot of people trying to give credit to Christianity for secularism, where say give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and we mentioned that if you look at that in context, that's only about the taxes, but the specific verse, one of them is Acts 5:29. Which contradicts any suggestions for secularism, which says Peter and the other apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than human beings," which is very anti-secular. He also, let me see if they're saying, also Romans 13, 1-2 says to obey man's law or suffer God's to obey man's law suffer God's punishment. So wait, is that a contradiction? There is a. Let me see if that's a contradiction. Let me bring up that verse, because there seems to be contradicting the Acts one, if that's what he says. Romans 13, 1-2. So let everyone be subject to the governing authority. Okay, so see the Romans one, it seems to be contradicting the Acts one, if I'm reading this right, because this one is saying, let everyone subject to the government authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. So this one is so this one contradicts the Acts one, because it's saying that just to follow your government authorities, but even this one is still contradicting Enlightenment values, which is suggests that any authority is basically God's. It's been established by God. So when people say that we need to give thanks to Christianity when it comes to because of the Reformation movement popularizing protest and popularizing questioning authority, well, that goes against Romans 13, 1-2, which specifically says that you should follow authority. You should, because it's been chosen. And in fact, isn't this the verse that a lot of kings use as a way to tell their people, their subjects, that you just need to listen to me even if I'm a shitty king? It doesn't matter that I'm a shitty king. I've been ordained by God, because every king.
There's quotes in the Bible to justify kings. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So it says, it continues. The second part is so the authorities that exist have been established by God, and then it continues. Romans 13, 2. It says, consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. Doesn't seem like very, this, the whole name Protestant comes from protesting, and this verse pretty much tells you that you shouldn't be protesting shit. So good luck giving credit to the Christianity for any act of rebellion. But go on.
Yeah, one thing that I didn't mention about Martin Luther is he called reason a whore. He said reason is a whore and it's the greatest enemy of faith.
Okay, say it again, guys. This is Martin Luther.
You can Google it. Reason is a whore,
Yeah.
the greatest enemy of faith.
This is this is your Reformation movement that you.
Yeah, Martin Luther started the Reformation. Yeah.
Yeah. So the people
He was also sexist,
people
right?
try again. This is, let me just repeat this. This is important. The people trying to give credit to the Reformation for the age of reason. You have to understand that the founder of the Reformation said that reason is a whore. Okay.
Yep, he did.
You can't get more anti-reason than that. In the live chat, Powerful Aura is saying Enlightenment era values are what made West great, not Judeo-Christian values. Exactly. In fact, Judeo-Christian values was what we had to fight against to be able to make the West great. It's amazing. It's amazing that people are giving credit to the values that stood against Enlightenment values for why the West is great today. It's absolutely, it's amazing, and it's so weird that so many otherwise intelligent people are taking it seriously. Some big names that claim that are Dave Rubin, um, Jordan Peterson, and who else? Oh my god, I can't believe I forgot his name. Hold on. I hope he's not watching this because we met a couple of times. Douglas Murray. Fuck, I'm really bad with names. And
Yeah, Douglas Murray kind of is disappointing to me. I didn't realize how I guess conservative he is. You know what I mean? Like I thought he was like, because I've seen a couple of debates he's done, but
right.
You know, I think he moderated a Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson debate or two, and his opinions like really surprised me that I saw on that.
It's very interesting because he at the same time claims that the problem with like our generation is that we want to throw away history and we're not paying attention to history, even though there's a lot of things to learn and understand from it. And at the same time, he also was quoted saying that where do you think human rights come from? Of course, they come from Christianity. So I mean, anybody that studies history even a little bit would know that most of these values were addressed in much deeper way before Christianity was ever a thing. I really don't understand how you could say that if you actually value studying history. Yeah, I mean, do you know about King Kurush of Iran? I don't know how you say it in English. Kurush. I forgot how you said English. His real name is Kurush, but in Western way they say Cyrus, King Cyrus, right? Cyrus, yeah. The Cyrus cylinder. That's the first recorded declaration of human rights. And even though it's shitty compared to our modern day values, it was still pretty extraordinary for its time because I mean, most of it was basically him praising himself, but the rest of it was giving their rights to the people that he conquered to practice their own religion or practice their own way of life, rather than having to adopt a new gods and a new culture, a new way of life. So he was the first multicultural king recorded in history, and for his time, this was a pretty crazy suggestion, right? And that freedom of practice and freedom of religion and freedom of thought, that predates the Bible by thousands of years, right? So, to suggest that the Bible had anything to do with that is extraordinary. Sorry, you wanted to add something here?
Oh, not to that, no.
Okay,
no.
I'm gonna read
some. I would make a comment. I would make a comment. There's, in my own studies about the Enlightenment, there's so many names that people don't know about, and a lot of them are, or at least several of them are atheists. Like there's one called a guy named Helvetius, and he was an atheist basically, and his writings were like really influential, and they inspired like who Cesare Beccaria is?
No.
He was a writer in the Enlightenment, and he wrote a book called On Crimes and Punishment about reforming the criminal law, and that was extremely influential. Jefferson and every major political person basically read it, and it was all about reforming criminal law and making it more humane and proportional to the crime and that kind of thing. And he was inspired by the works of Helvetius and also Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote The Rights of Woman in 1792, a big feminist author. She was inspired by his arguments that the only reason we have inequalities of women and men is because they lack the equal opportunity to be, educated, basically. And there's just so many people, if you read about it, during the Enlightenment that made a big impact that were not religious or were even atheists, And I think I mentioned last podcast, evolution goes back to ancient Greece, right? Theories of evolution, Diderot wrote about evolution, so.
And this whole idea of people being equal and stuff, and human rights, that's what led to a movement against slavery as well, coming out of Europe, right? Like the whole idea. I mean, the one major benefit of that was this whole argument that we should end slavery, right? Is that correct? That you could tie in the end of slavery to Enlightenment, the fact that the Enlightenment values becoming popular in Europe?
Yeah, I think you
Yeah.
can. Yeah.
Yeah, and the interesting thing that is with that is also a lot of Christians try to give credit to Christianity for ending slavery, even though the Bible itself condones slavery.
Right.
We have specific verses for that. Yeah, I mean, again, because I don't see. I mean, we're not we're not philosophers here, okay? And this seems pretty obvious. I mean, you are, I but we're not. I mean, I'm not an expert, and you just look basic history, and you can see based on anybody that has studied the history, and you talk to them, you can see that where these values are coming from. It doesn't seem like one of those mysteries of history that requires much digging for you to be able to put two and two together. Like any expert that has studied history, when you start talking to them about this, they will admit to this, to everything that we have said here. I mean, go, just anybody. This is not the things that we're saying here. The fact, the stuff that we're talking about, the Protestant thinkers, the Reformation founders, the stuff that we're talking about, the Enlightenment thinkers, the stuff that we're talking about, what the result of what they did was, and the thoughts, the values that came out of the Reformation movement, what they were and how they contradict with the Enlightenment values. These are not disputed. These are not things that there is a debate about any of this, right?
Right.
If you go read about these are all there. So the fact that this is such an obvious part of history rather than some of those more controversial disputed parts, it makes it even more bizarre that these claims exist out there, that the Western values have come out of Christianity. I'm still trying to. One thing, I mean, I see why Christians might be saying that. Obviously, the same way Muslims try to take credit for. This is very similar to, you know, how we had the golden age of Islam, which I think has been labeled incorrectly. It should have been labeled the golden age of Arabs and Persians,
Right.
because they went through that
Nothing to
golden.
do with Islam, right?
Yeah, because it had nothing to do with Islam. I think it's very similar to that, because the Arab Empire did went through a golden age. Nobody can deny that. They had lots of science and philosophy and art, and they almost had an enlightenment until Ghazali came and fucked it up. So they went through that. And a lot of Muslims today want to claim credit for that. They're like, look, we had our golden age. Islam is not backwards. How could we have a golden age if Islam is so backward? We had like mathematics, chemistry, philosophy, all that good stuff, right? And like,
Hmm.
okay, it goes. They are making the same argument that Christians are making, and I was like, okay, yeah, you did have that, but show me why was because of Islam. I mean, the fact is that the Arab Empire became rich. Every empire that gets very rich, at some point, it stops thinking about war and starts looking into poetry, philosophy, arts, and science. That's how every fucking empire went through when they became rich. Those thinkers did science because they were scientists, not because they were Muslim. Those philosophers did philosophy because they were philosophers, not because they were Muslims. They did art because they were artists, not because they were Muslim. In fact, a lot of them were anti-Islamic, very anti-Islamic, right?
Right.
Which people, when people read their quotes back in Baghdad, people are shocked to know that there were such anti-Islamic, anti-Quranic views back then, right under the Khalifa's nose. But so I understand why Muslims do it. I understand why Christians do it. But the bizarre thing, especially more recently, is that a lot of atheists are making the same arguments. A lot
Yeah, I
of
don't
a
get that at all.
Well, I have a hypothesis for why they're making it, and I think it's more of an anti-Islam thing more than a pro-Christian thing. What do you think about that? I think a lot of it's a crisis of identity rather than any actual legitimate arguments for it. It's basically uh, a response to immigration, a response to Islam growing as a religion, and people trying to go back to their roots, and they just have a misunderstanding of what those roots were, and they thinking that maybe they saying like atheists don't have anything to offer when it comes to guarding against Islam, and maybe our best hope against Islam or our best hope against this crisis of identity is Christianity, especially because it has such a long history and has a proven history as they think. And you go back to Christianity not because Christianity is true, but because there's no other alternative against these threats.
They
That's
may think that,
right.
but they're wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I know they're wrong, but I think. Do you think that that's part of the reason?
Again, they could think that, but
It
again,
no,
they're wrong.
I know they're wrong. I agree with you that they're wrong. I mean, the best thing against Islam is the same thing that we against Christianity, which is
Yeah.
Enlightenment values. I mean, if
I don't
you
get why Christians don't understand that, like, the separation of church and state is about fairness. Secularism is about, at least in the political sense, is about fairness, right?
Mm.
Because if any one religion can control the government, any can, right? I mean, like, it's about keeping things fair and peaceful. I mean, because we had thousands of years of history to teach us, about persecution and what happens, right, with theocracies.
Right.
But
But my response to that is that you should defeat Islam with the same tools you defeated Christianity, and that's the Enlightenment values, right? If you want to learn anything
yeah,
from history, learn that. But
if you think Islamic extremists are more extreme than Christians used to be, then you need to read history again.
right.
I mean,
Do, do you have before? I want to go to the live chat and see some of the
yep.
points that people brought up, but I wanted to see. Did you want to bring up a couple of other points before I do that?
I would. Do you want to get into the United States, the founding of the United States, a little bit?
Yeah, quickly go over that.
It'll take a while. If you want to go ahead and get into the live chat,
Okay, let me
I
just.
have some documentation here.
Okay. Let me look at the live chat really quickly. We missed a few good stuff at the top. I hope it. Okay. Uh. Ooh, okay. So Renzo is saying devil's advocate. Calvinism legitimated capitalism, interest rate, and profit seeking, whereas Catholicism was very anti-commerce.
You know what Calvin advocated? He advocated predestination. So everybody is predestined to either go to hell or go to heaven. So, like, why even do anything? Like, it's a very pessimistic, worldview. It's like everything is preordained. It doesn't matter what you do, right? Which is a big, huge problem with Christianity is, they say it's good works also, but it is contradicted because, you talk about it's belief. Belief is salvation. Like, what God would be so stupid that they would know that authentic belief is not an option? You don't really decide what you believe, right? So believing is what gets you salvation, not acts, not
Yeah.
moral acts. Thomas Jefferson, he called Calvin's God a demon. He said it'd be better to believe in no God at all than to blaspheme him by calling him by attributing the things that Calvin attributes to God. And he talks, about just all the absurdity and the malignancy of Calvin and his beliefs. So that's
Yeah. So Renzo also says Calvinism was also used to legitimize insurrection against tyrants in the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the U.S. But so the point, there's 2 points basically to this. First of all, Calvinism also came with a lot of shit, like as you mentioned, that is very against humanist values or Enlightenment values.
yeah.
But at the same time, even these specific examples that in Calvinism, which is pro interest rate, pro capitalism, or pro or anti tyrant. The thing is, you would be even more excused to say these came from, like, Calvinism had something to do with that, so those examples, specific examples, but not really Christianity. Even though I understand that Calvinism is a branch of Christianity, the thing is that the core of Christianity doesn't have anything anything with regards to those ideas. Like, show me where in the Bible capitalism is promoted or profit seeking is promoted. Show me
Or freedom.
or freedom, or where in the Bible specifically
The
any
Bible, the New
movement against the
Testament,
tyrants. What?
the New Testament explicitly is against equal rights for women. It says they should be submissive, cannot teach or hold authority over men.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
it teaches slaves to stay in your station, basically.
Right.
Serve your masters well. So,
Wolf is saying
like
Christianity.
Matt Dillahunty says, God can teach us not to eat shrimp, but he can't preach it. Tell us, not to own slaves. It's like it's God.
Yeah.
That's
It would take just one line. Don't own another human being. Wolf is saying Christianity is super narcissistic. Muscal is saying, do you think we need an Enlightenment movement now? If so, what would it look like? Actually, I wanted to have another discussion later on with you, specifically about what Muscal is saying, to come up with a strategy, to come up with thinking about like how could we first of all popularize valuing and giving credit to Enlightenment thinkers and value, and also using that popularity to replicate it again, especially in Islamic countries, right? I mean, I know a lot of people in Islamic countries are a big fan of these thinkers and are against Islamic values. Yeah. Even a lot of people read these books as an act of rebellion.
It's awesome.
But I was wondering how we could. I mean, the movement. A lot of people, when they talk about like going to these countries and trying to spread these ideas, the way they think about it, I think, is that we need to start from scratch. But that's not. It's not. That's not how it works, because these movements already exist there on the ground. What is needed is for us to discover people that are doing this, underground, because they usually are doing it against the law, and try to find out how we can, how we can help, and how also we can spread their ideas, and how we could help them with their recruitment process, right? And give them a louder voice. And again, this is why what we're going to do at Atheist Republic, once we get enough funding and support, is to get to do a lot of translation, both the translation of activists on the ground in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and everywhere else, to English, so that their voices are heard from on a global scale, and also to translate our content from English to their language, so that basically make the barriers and communication, break down the barriers of communication, right? So that's one goal we have. But I do want us to have another episode about how a second enlightenment, a global enlightenment, like the Enlightenment movement era that we had was mostly a European Enlightenment movement, right? And then also an American as well, right? But how are we able to have a second age of enlightenment on a global scale, right? So maybe we could have a discussion about that. So let me see. Sorry. It's not scrolling. Many of the wars oh, come on. Sorry, I need to buy a new computer. Where did that go? I read that one already. Muscal, I read that one. What's the next one? Okay, yeah. Reza is saying many of the words you, Landon, mentioned were also driven by aristocratic rivalry, not just religious fanaticism, which is but we didn't mention that it was only religion, right? Religion had a major role to play, but it wasn't just religion. Go on.
What are they getting at? I'm sorry, I missed that.
So you're saying it wasn't just religion that started those wars. It was also a lot of aristocrats competing with each other that caused those wars.
Yeah, there's always been other factors, but I mean, religion is what makes it where you can't even compromise, right? It's a matter, of heaven and hell, and and that it brings the hatred to as extreme as it can get, right?
Right.
And you can't compromise on God's law, right? Or you used to not. Yeah.
The way I say what you just said is that religion is usually not the only factor, but it's a very negative factor.
Yeah.
Wolf is saying human race come from humans, not a black book. Wolf is also saying my mother was part native. It's somebody comments. So my mother was part native. My biological father was a regular white. My stepfather whom raised me was a white man. Never was I thought anything to do with religion. I don't know what is that in response to. Theo Mikey is saying I'm late. What's up? Theo Mikey is saying have you guys discussed individualism? Do you want to talk about the source of individualism and whether or not anything in the Bible is responsible for individualism?
That's not really a topic I've read too much into, but I don't see where that would be in the Bible.
Yeah, I don't see it
Really.
in apologists, because Theomaki is saying apologists always say that individualism is a Judeo-Christian value. The only verse that they use to support is that humans are made in God's image, but that doesn't follow. So actually, yeah, that was from all the arguments that I brought up for why Christianity is responsible for Western values or Judeo-Christian values are responsible for Western values. This is also one of them. So even they say that even if you can't directly connect freedom of speech, due process, and all that other good stuff to, there is no specific commandments for that in the Bible. The truth is that the value of an individual was increased because of the Bible, right? Like rather than just a tribe or a government or individualism came from the Bible, and the reason for that is that God says in the Bible says that we were made in God's image, right? And again, the arguments against that is that, well, individualism wasn't that popular until recently, so how come 1700 years of Christianity was never responded?
Okay,
Yeah, go on.
but Christianity crushed the individual. It was
Yeah,
all about conformity. It's all about bow down and don't talk back, and
yep,
that's whole history. It's a history of massacring people with incorrect views that express their individual views, right?
yeah.
Um, so that doesn't add up.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Uh,
Theo Mikey
in
himself
the
is not
Bible,
reading the Bible. Go, go.
it may talk about you're God's children, but it also says you're like worms and you're unworthy and you can't do anything without God's help. So,
Right.
and everything is due to God. Constantly, like somebody will achieve something or get better from a sickness, and they'll, all praise be to God, but they never give themselves credit or the people that help them credit. The science and the doctors or the whoever in a job that help them. So you're talking about individualism that seems to take away from the individuals and the individuals involved in individual achievement, right?
Yeah, I mean, if this is how your God contributed to these values, your God is a shitty writer, because every time you try to connect any of these values to the Bible, you can see it's such a vague and loose connection that you really have to use your imagination to be able to give credit to any of this shit. I mean, if you look at the Enlightenment thinkers, the way they wrote about these values, the amount of how specific they were and how I mean, you can't confuse what they are saying, right? You can exactly see what specifically the values they're promoting and the reasoning behind the why they think these values are worth adopting. Like, it's very
Did
clear. It's
Christianity
very
promote
well
the
explained.
individual?
What?
Sorry, did Christianity promote the individual rights of women?
No.
I don't think so, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Think about it.
Theomaki is not, by the way, saying that. He's basically he himself agrees with us. He just wants us to respond to it. But
Gotcha.
but what I'm also saying, like, is that the even if you just really want to be charitable to these arguments, and you say that this God was trying to promote these values with these verses, the fact that you have to play such a, be this flexible with the meaning of these verses for them to mean what you want them to mean, makes your God, the best you could say about the Christian God is that he really sucked at communication, right? Like,
Yeah.
each one of these thinkers managed to communicate these values to the rest of humanity in much more effective ways than your Bible ever could.
Well, we know now that the Bible is kind of a wiki. It was composed by different people, right,
Right.
and different cultures even. And like, if you look in Genesis, like they know that like it has multiple authors, right?
Mm.
So they have like the J author, the P author. I forget the rest of them, but you can just tell by the style of the writing, and they call God by different names. Like one is Yahweh and one is Elohim, I think. I think that's right. So they've kind of dissected a lot of this, and they know how it's different people over time. And there's like in Genesis 1 and 2 they repeat the story, so there's a duplication of the story. Obviously another writer rewrote the first part, so all these that we have all these contradictions, right, because different people wrote them, and a lot of them had different values, right? So you can even look at Genesis and look at the Old Testament with sexuality, and look at be fruitful and multiply, right? But in the New Testament, it's like marriage is like a distraction before the imminent end times that are right around the corner. So, if you want to pull values, an overall coherent picture, a package of values from the Bible, you have a lot of problems because of all the contradictions and everything else. You know what I mean?
Right.
Why do we have so many goddamn thousands of sects of Christianity? Because God does not speak clearly, and he's vague, and he's clearly a human author or authors, right? Because if it was clear, we could not possibly have all these different sects.
Yeah, and actually, if you study like Bart Ehrman and you actually go look into the history for why something made it into the Bible and something else didn't, um, you could see that what it suggests is that most of the motivation behind what made it into the Bible was political. And given that we have that evidence, I mean, if you look at what biblical scholars will tell us, you can see the political motives behind putting a book like Bible together, which is
Yeah,
interesting. Which is very interesting because the atheists that are Christian apologists and suggest that there's some hidden meanings in this that is good for all humanity. They make it seem like whoever put the Bible together, these were some great thinkers that had some profound knowledge about uh, the values that Enlightenment thinkers only came up with 1700 years later, but they already knew it back then. But for some reason, instead of just communicating that with us, they put it in stories and hid it in like enigmas for us to. Instead of just putting it right there for us to read, they just put it in
right,
enigmas for us to be able to have to solve a fucking puzzle to be able to get it out of there. And that's why it took 1700 years apparently for people to figure it out, because they hid it in there. And it's just weird for me for somebody to suggest that people back then, even I understand that people that wrote the Bible are, for their time. I mean, these were the scholars at the time. I mean, anybody that could read and write as a scholar was probably a scholar at the time. But again, their understanding of of the universe, of biology, of our brain was very much backwards compared to the thinkers that came after them, right? And
right,
but at the same time, even if they even I mean, that doesn't stop you from contributing good values. I mean, thinkers before them, like in ancient Greece, they also had limited understanding, but at least they promoted a process, whereas you used logic uh, and critical thinking for you to come up with your conclusions, even with the limited information they had, right? But
right.
but if you look in history, if the motivation behind the people that put the Bible together looks much like a political
Political.
motivation. Yeah,
Yeah.
it
The
wasn't
councils of men that put them together. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
and given that we have this information, it just it's again amazes me that these modern atheists, Christian apologists, atheists suggest that there seems to be some grand design behind putting very valuable hidden values in behind stories that you only have to read it in a certain way for you to be able to get it. Like, where are you getting this from? Because everything else we know about history suggests otherwise. The only thing that we have that for on your side is just you suggesting it, you claiming it, but we have nothing beyond your claim that there is such a thing in these stories. Anyways, go on.
Yeah. I saw a document that Robert G. Ingersoll wrote that said, if Jesus was God, he knew that, there would be countless wars and oppression and tyranny, in his name when he came, but he didn't do anything to speak clearly to keep that from happening, right? He knew that all the carnage and terror would follow after he was dead, right? He was God, right? He knew all this would happen. So that's something to think about. And, if only he was God, he would have known about, like bacteria and the things that actually were causing like so many kids to die around him by the thousands, right? While he was doing his little isolated miracles, right? Supposedly, you know what I mean?
Right.
But instead we have gospels that say, mud and spit can cure blindness, faith can conquer poison, and demons cause illness, right? So, where do you put that?
Yeah, I mean, you would take just one verse like that. Before you do operation, wash your hands in wine. Wouldn't that be such a great verse to have in the Bible?
It would have
Like,
saved so many lives, right?
yeah, you would
It would
just
have advanced human civilization,
yeah, I mean, if you just had that in the Bible or the Quran, hey, wash your hands in wine and your tools before doing surgery. How many people's lives would be saved if we just had that? But it took again, again, it took the Enlightenment movement also to popularize the scientific method as well. So that's
Right.
also something where we need to give credit to the Enlightenment era. Not that we didn't have science before it, but the scientific method became such a popular thing because of that era. Just a few more live chat comments. Theo Mackie is saying because right after the verses in Genesis, the verses that he mentioned that we were made in God's image in Genesis, also got in the same Genesis book, the Genesis, God wipes out humanity with a flood, divides them into races, then chooses one race as his chosen one.
And he has regrets even though he doesn't make mistakes.
Right.
And he gets mad and stuff even though he's perfect, right?
Yeah, and he basically Theo Mikey's saying I don't read individualism into that. Yeah, so basically, yes, God values human life and individualism. This is the same God that wiped out most of humanity because he gave them free will and then they didn't act in the way he wanted them to.
Which he would have known already, right?
Yeah, and he wiped them out with a fucking flood. Yeah, value human life for sure. And then he divides, and he's, yeah, and the fact that he has a chosen race of people as his favorite people goes against Enlightenment values as well. There, it's so amazing because we could sit here all day and give you examples that go against humanist values, go against Enlightenment values, and we could like write essays on different examples in the Bible, and all they have is like, hey, love your neighbor, like, yeah, okay, and they just go just hang into that, like, please just let us use this one thing for us to be able to say that we're responsible for Enlightenment values. Okay, good luck with that. Theo Mike is saying, and his chosen people are often collectively punished instead of individually, because when the Hebrews sin, God punishes them collectively. Yeah. Just I mean, imagine if you bomb an entire city because of the actions of a few people there, right? God did that. Theo Mackie is saying the first time we start getting a glimpse of individualism is the Athenian democracy, so democracy based in Athens, which we know was imperfect, but it was refined and perfected in the Enlightenment. Yeah, again, these I'm hope we're not suggesting that none of these values were suggested before the Enlightenment. No, the Enlightenment popularized them and really added a lot of nuance and a lot of critical thinking to some of these values that people did talk about way before it.
They were kind of the founders of the social sciences, right?
Yes,
The
exactly.
Enlightenment.
Yeah.
So,
by the way, a lot of people, I know this is not relevant, but a lot of people do say that the only pure democracy that we ever had in history was in Athens. That's not true, because women were not allowed to vote. Moose Gal is saying, I believe the Middle East, I think also slaves, I don't know. Moose Gal is saying, I believe the Middle East countries need an Enlightenment movement. As for the U.S., we need the pro-science, pro-evidence base. Well, I mean, you have that, Muscal. Relative to other countries, you're way ahead of everybody else. But yeah, that doesn't mean there's no room for more progress. So, and again, Theomachy as ultimately Judeo-Christian values are just Trojan horse to try to take credit for Enlightenment values and sneak in bigoted, outdated ideas into the modern world. Exactly, Theomachy. And Theomachy also adds the Enlightenment made science the popular, I don't know, paradigm, and it's a paradigm that works. Is that how you say that? Yeah. Before that it was Christianity, but the Reformation proved its divisive. Yeah, it's a divisive paradigm. Is that how you say that? Yeah. Again, English is my second language, but I'm learning every day.
Did you want to get into the American sphere of things,
Yes,
like the
please go
American
ahead.
Constitution? Okay. Um, what I thought I'd do is go through some quotes of some American founders. I think you probably have heard most of these, but maybe some of your viewers haven't. You know, uh, so just one quote from John Quincy Adams talking about Thomas Jefferson. He says, Enlightenment philosophy Jefferson imbibed in the 1760s from a teacher at William and Mary in Virginia that led Jefferson to the mysteries of free thinking and irreligion, loose morals, and of not being an absolute atheist, someone whose belief did not believe in a future existence. He combined his hostility to religious authority with his hostility to aristocracy, which arose from his infidel philosophy. And even some Enlightenment figures like John Adams, who did think that you needed some type of religion to ground morality in society, he still was a heretical Unitarian who he hated the clergy and religious dogmatism and theological mysteries. He didn't believe in Jesus being divine or all kinds of things. So, but getting to the exact quotes, like, let's see. I'm taking these from my book, by the way. I have a chapter on theocracy, which gets into the Enlightenment and
Can you mention?
the.
Oh my God.
Go ahead.
Can you mention your book again for the people that joined later in the conversation?
Justified faith.
How could you justify faith? Somebody will say.
Oh, well, it depends on how you want to define faith, right?
Okay.
I guess I mean belief, right?
Right.
I use faith more because it sounded better, I guess, and to contrast it with religious faith. But you don't have to call it faith. I mean, you can call it belief.
Right.
You know, should you have belief in humanity? I say it's justified to have belief in humanity because of the overall progress we've made, right?
Right.
Going from cave dwellers to space explorers, right? And just all the things that humanity has achieved. Contrasting that with religious faith. But the founders, right?
So the founders were very much impacted by the European
Yeah,
Enlightenment thinkers.
and they a lot of them knew each other, which we got into some in the last podcast that we did.
Yeah. They wrote a lot
They
of
lived.
letters to each other, right?
Yeah, and Franklin and Jefferson lived in France, and they Franklin went to the famous atheist the Holbach salon. He met him. So yeah, and Helvetius. He actually Franklin. I mentioned Helvetius earlier. After Helvetius died, Franklin proposed to his widow. She kept like the salon alive long after he died, and a lot of like philosophers and atheists and people came there. And Franklin actually, he was a big womanizer, right? Franklin.
Yeah.
He actually proposed Helvetius's wife, his widow. So that's funny. And Benjamin Franklin actually, it said he belonged to the Hellfire Club, which was like this really anti-Christian, group. So anyway, I guess maybe you've heard of Franklin talking about how he became a deist. He read like some books against deism, and that actually turned him to deism because they were more convincing than the arguments against it. And, yeah, a lot of people called him an atheist too, even though he really wasn't. But was talking about legislation, right? So this is a quote from James Madison, who was one of the main writer of the Constitution, framer. It's from a document called Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessment in 1785. It says, during almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What have been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, servility and ignorance in the laity, and both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. So, I mean, that's kind of taking Christianity to trial right there, right?
Right.
For, it's saying throughout history, it's had bigotry, superstition, persecution, ignorance, servility. So, who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity and exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians and exclusion of all others? James Madison from the same document. Again, James Madison, in a letter to Edward Livingston, July 10th, 1822, every new and successful example of a perfect separation between ecclesiastical and civil matters is of importance. I have no doubt that every new example will succeed as every past one has done in showing that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together.
I'm gonna read. Can I read some of a few of the live chat?
Sure.
So Muscal is saying, how do we I'm going to actually use this as a excuse for a shameless plug. Muscal is saying, how do we take back the Enlightenment movement back from the religious of the world? Well, Muscal, we could do that by donating to Atheist Republic and supporting Atheist Republic, because that's exactly what we're trying to do here. And if we do get enough support, we'll be able to also do this in many in Arabic, Persian. So that's the question that you're asking is exactly what we're trying to do with our podcast, the books that we're publishing, the YouTube videos that we're doing. But we don't want to just do. If we're talking about the world, we want to be able to do that in every language. So as soon as we get enough resources for that, we'll get on that. And there's a lot of demand, a lot of support for this, especially in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Indonesia. So if so, yeah, this is the question that you're asking is a question that we're asking ourselves every day, and try to come up with ways to spread those ideas. Theo Mikey is saying, ever notice that we can admit the faults of people who gave us our values, like in America, the slavery and what in America, like I think he's talking about what happened to natives. But Judeo-Christian supporters always try to excuse ancient slavery and sexism. Yeah, this is another interesting point, because a lot of when you talk about Enlightenment values, one counter point to that is like, well, did you know that this person had slaves and this Enlightenment thinker did that, and this guy was like did this bad thing or that bad thing? And I'm like, yeah, these Enlightenment thinkers, they contributed great values, and we don't see them as gods, right? Like we don't see them as sacred. It's not like you're looking at it the way you look at your Jesus. That's
Exactly.
not how we're not looking at them the way you look at Jesus. These are
Excellent
flawed.
point.
Yeah, these are flawed men that contributed some great values, and we acknowledge their flaws.
But you know what a constant theme is, though, throughout the Enlightenment? All the names that preached against religion, they preached against sexism and slavery and all of that stuff. I mean, like, I could go through names like Toland, Diderot, Condorcet. All these guys preached against sexism and, lower status for women. They preached against slavery, and they preached against religion. All this stuff kind of went together for a whole lot of these philosophers and writers.
Right.
So,
I mean, the fact is that there are a lot of people are not slaves today because of these thinkers. A lot of women have rights today because of these thinkers, right?
yeah.
And we could say that at the same time acknowledging the shitty things that they did. In fact, it's a good thing.
Well, a lot of these people, there's nothing shitty you can say about them. Like
even the examples that you have, whatever examples that you have, even the small, even if it's a few are far in between. The thing is that even if they didn't do any shitty things, but they had some crazy views and they had some along right with the good values that they have, they said some stupid shit. The good thing about the fact is that these we will, because the values that we are advocating for is not set in stone, and we can constantly rewrite it and improve it.
Right.
The reason is because we're willing to acknowledge the problems with the we don't see these thinkers as divine authority that you have to take everything that we said. And that's not a they point at it as if this is a flaw, but actually that's a feature. That the fact
Right.
that the fact that you have to defend every shitty thing that comes out of your book, that's your problem. That's a flaw with your ideology. That's not a problem when it comes to the way we look at values. We will constantly rewrite and admit mistakes.
Yeah. And so, like, and for them too, it's like a big task to try to make sense of all these, bad things and contradictions in history and scripture. I mean, but for me, it's what religion is man-made. It's what it should look like, right? There might be some good things here and there, but it's a lot of crap. It looks man-made, right? So.
Right. Muscal is saying, Armin, so Atheist Republic is an antidote for everything wrong with the religious of the world? No. I was just saying we're one of the many, a small part of the many organizations that are trying to do. Of course, there's many others that are doing the same thing, and they all deserve support. But she continues that I still a nice plug. Oh, thank you. Love your confidence in what you're doing. Well, yeah, I wouldn't be doing it if I wasn't confident that it was helpful. All right, so anything else we need to add before we start wrapping it up?
Yeah, I have a quote here by, and I guess we won't get into all the American founder quotes. You can look those up. I mean,
just give me the best ones. Give me the best ones.
Okay, I'll try to go really quick. Some have made the love of God the foundation of morality. If we did a good act merely from love of God and a belief that it is pleasing to him, whence arises the morality of the atheist? Diderot, de Holbach, Condorcet, d'Alembert are known to have been among the most virtuous of men. Their virtue, then, must have had some other foundation than the love of God. Thomas Jefferson to Thomas Law, June 13, 1814. There's a lot of quotes. Jefferson talking against priests and, questioning God and saying that there's never been a free people that's been ruled by priests. Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason, which was a book that was completely against Christianity and was a big seller all over the world. There's a lot of quotes I could get to. John Adams talking against forcing Christianity on people and that people should be able to write what they want. Yeah, I could go on and on there because that's something I've studied a lot. But yeah, that is time consuming to just.
Any book that you recommend for? Oh my god, any book that you recommend for somebody, for a person that is just getting started, not very advanced, very simple and easy to read, to get introduced to the Enlightenment thinkers and what they and their ideas?
Yeah, probably the one I showed you earlier. This one right here by Peter Gay. It's just called The Enlightenment: The Rise of Modern Paganism by Peter Gay.
Okay. Do you mind
it's kind of a classic, so yeah.
Do you mind sending me the link to all these, anything you mentioned, including your own book, and where can people find you and follow you?
Just on Atheist Republic. I just got through posting, or had 2 blogs posted. One of them is called Hardship in Atheism, and another one is called Atheist Before Darwin. So it's kind of going through some of the atheists, like in the Enlightenment. And this is a great book on some of those atheists, real quick. It's called A Wicked Company.
To your left. Go to your left. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
A Wicked Company by Philip Bloom, I think.
Okay.
The Forgotten Radicalism of the European Enlightenment. It talks about, a lot of the atheists in the Enlightenment, like de Holbach and Diderot and their big circle that were really influential. I was going to get to the Constitution, like some stuff about it, before we're out of time. That's That's cool. That's
We could have another full episode on the founding fathers of United States and how United States is not a Christian country founded on Christianity. We could have a
right.
specific episode for that. Christy is saying in the live chat, can't go wrong with supporting Atheist Republic and Freedom from Religion Foundation. Yep, shout out to Freedom from Religion Foundation. Theo Mackie is saying, so you mentioned Dobak.
The
Dolbach.
whole Bakken.
Well, Theo Mackie is saying the H is silent. There's no, it's pronounced Dolbach. So thank you for Theo Mackie for that.
I've heard it pronounced differently.
In Europe, it's pronounced differently.
I've heard it pronounced differently.
Oh,
so.
you heard it pronounced differently.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, if people pronounce things wrong, that means they read a lot, which instead of listening to things a lot, which is fine.
Yep.
Well, so it could mean that. Anyways, thank you so much for your time. Again, go send me the links on Facebook so I could put everything in the live chat. By the way, we've been very generous with your time, so please, guys, go show him support for everything for all the stuff that we learned from Landon today. Go check out his book. His book is in the description. He's a really good writer. And also check out the books that he's recommending. Again, the name of your book was Justified Faith. Again, don't. He's using the word faith with a different definition of it. Don't get turned off by that. Like, good example of that is Sam Harris's book Spirituality, right? Like spiritual. But what's the full title?
Waking up.
Waking up. A guide to spirituality without religion. The spirituality,
It's a good book.
Yeah. So spirituality in Sam Harris's book doesn't mean the spirituality that people usually mean when they say spirituality. So in Landon's book, faith doesn't mean the same thing that people usually mean when they say faith. So go check out his book. He's a really good writer, and also check out his blog posts on Atheist Republic. Thank you. So. Okay. Be just saying thank you, Landon and Armin, and all the chatters. Yeah, and thank you everybody in the live chat. Christy, as usual, is always lovely to have you here. Haley, Beej, also is great to have you. Theo Mikey, glad you could join. Muscal, thank you for your great questions. Wolf as well. Everybody else in the live chat. People earlier. Ice Goddess was here as well. Disidentity was here. Benjamin and everyone else. All right. Cool. 2 live streams for you today on Atheist Republic. So, you see, we're working very hard for you guys. So, please go ahead and support us on atheistrepublic.com. And also, subscribe to our newsletter. Because you can't trust YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or anyone else. They hate our content. They think it's too sensitive for their platform. So, you might not get the notification that you're wanting to get. We might not show up on your feed. So, if you want to make sure you get our content, go to atheistrepublic.com and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that we actually show up on your inbox every time we have some content. All right. Bye, everyone. Love you all. And thank you again, Landon, for your time. It was very interesting.
Thanks.